Hello, I'm Janine from South Africa, the LMF for the Afrikaans Ministry at Eindelijk Hoop. Today I'm going to share about what I've learned from doing a podcast and from Aaron's teachings regarding a podcast. I will also be sharing about some of the mistakes I made because I don't know about you, but many times I learn out of others' mistakes and, of course, out of my own mistakes. So I will also share about what I learned out of my own mistakes. A few weeks ago, I did a podcast with a very special guest, my very own twin sister, about a very sensitive subject, what she went through as a child when a man took advantage of her when she was 7 years old. We had discussed what we were going to talk about beforehand, but because it was such a sensitive subject, and because it was only the second time we were talking about it as sisters, we were both so much on our nerves. I wanted it to be perfect, and that was my biggest mistake. So when we made a mistake, I would restart. I know that was totally wrong. I must have never restarted, so my advice is don't restart, even if it is with a guest you are comfortable with, like your own sister, because I believe and trust the Lord will use our mistakes for good. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. One of the most important principles before doing a podcast is to simply seek God before doing the podcast. We did seek God, but with such a sensitive subject, I know I must have given my guest more time beforehand to seek God. And I have to admit a fault I have. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Overall, I talk too much, and especially when I get on my nerves. So I didn't give my guest enough time to talk. I did too much talking, but I asked my heavenly husband to help me in the future with that and to start listening more. And one of the most important guidance to any topic, the mind of man plans his way, but God directs his steps. So let the Lord lead. Because I had this whole podcast planned like a rehearsed podcast, and I feel it mustn't have been a rehearsed podcast. I must have let the Lord take over and lead, and just let my guest talk like the Lord directed her, even if it was my sister. But still I trust and believe the Lord will turn my mistake around for the good and use the podcast for the good. And remember to write your questions down because I didn't the first time and because it was not an easy topic, I forgot to ask about the forgiveness part and only realized it when we had finished and stopped recording. But my heavenly husband helped me to fix it and cover it in part 2. And yes, I learned out of my mistakes because in part 2, I gave my guest enough time to prepare. And I let the Lord take over when my special guest, again my sister, spoke and we recorded it only once. So the second podcast was not a rehearsed podcast. And another mistake was I didn't thank my guest at the end again. And I also didn't say thank you to the audience for listening. So I have to remember that in the future. But again, I will learn out of my mistakes. And relax and enjoy the podcast. The mistakes we make, the Lord will anyway turn around for the good. And I know that's advice I still have to follow. But I believe more and more I'll get my self-confidence from my heavenly husband. Thank you for taking the time to listen on what I had learned through my mistakes on doing a podcast.